Hi, I'm Meredith Busch, and today for Liberty University American Christian Heritage class, I'm going to discuss Mary Dyer, a Puritan dissident. We're also going to take a look at recent scholarship on her and her persecuted Quaker sisterin. Early on, Mary married William Dyer in 1633. She and her husband emigrated to Massachusetts in 1635, and famous Puritan John Winthrop called her a very proper and fair woman of a very proud spirit and much addicted to revelations. She had a miscarriage, but it was kind of quieted until 1638, when she stood by heretic Anne Hutchinson, who was excommunicated from the Puritan Church. And as she was sentenced and walked out from the church, Mary held her hand and exited along with her. This was a huge step for female solidarity in early America. Unfortunately, Anne Hutchinson in the same year suffered a miscarriage, and it was thought that her passion and her beliefs caused her to create this deformed creature. And so it was also found out and dug up that Mary Dyer had had a similar situation, and it was thought that it was truly a beast and a fowl and a fish, and these are more of John Winthrop's words describing the figure of the child itself. And it was thought that this was again a physical representation of Mary's thoughts. She was ostracized for this, and it was difficult. But eventually she and her husband returned to England. He had some business in 1652, when Quakerism was just kind of getting going. She stayed on longer than her husband, but in 1657 she returned to the colonies, where her family was in Rhode Island. And in 1657 to 1660 she went to Massachusetts as a Quaker to minister to people, to preach to people, and to stand by her brethren. And it was not common for women to do these things, and the Quaker faith was at odds with the Puritan faith, and Quakers were persecuted quite rampantly in Puritan Massachusetts. So she'd visit Massachusetts and she'd get banished, and she'd visit Massachusetts and she'd get sentenced to hanging, and then they would let her off the hook and exile her again, and she would come back because she stood by the people that she had left behind there. And so ultimately, on her third repeat to Massachusetts, she was sentenced to hanging. Sentenced to execution by hanging, and on June 1st, 1660, they succeeded in this. She was unrepentant and felt compelled that she had done God's will, that her continuing to minister to people in Massachusetts was God's will. These are some representations of her. The two on the left and the one on the previous slide are by Howard Pyle, kind of early 1900s artist who depicted her in a crowd of Puritans, appealing to the governor. And then this is an unknown artist, but this is a representation of Mary Dyer walking to the gallows. But today we're talking about recent scholarship, and so a lot of the recent scholarship has been done through a feminist framework. And so first I wanted to set the stage on feminist history. So one of my favorite authors, Connie Park Rice, an academic of women in the American South, she said, "The goal of feminist history, defined as historical work infused with concern about the past and present oppression of women, is to reread the work of female writers and artists to demonstrate the significance of women's voices and choices in the past." The article that sort of prompted this research is Angie Myles' From Monster to Martyr, Representing Mary Dyer. This is a 2001 article where she stresses the themes of agency and allegiance in Mary Dyer's story. These are two things that aren't really represented in female stories from the time frame, and it was really important to recognize that although some people thought Mary Dyer was insane or mad, or some people even argue that she had postpartum depression, something more pathological, she actually expressed a lot of agency in her decisions. She chose to be a vessel of God's will, and so she continued to go back to Massachusetts of her own accord. And in Myles's article, she does a rereading of Dyer's writing, a letter where she she talks a lot about the story of Esther. And this is a story of a woman disobeying man's orders to further God's will. And that's again ties in with the agency. The allegiance side, walking out of church with Anne Hutchinson and going back to Massachusetts to minister to your friends, to take care of prisoners, these are things that demonstrate a female solidarity. And that was really cutting edge. And so Myles argues that a lot of Mary Dyer's story and a lot of other Quaker stories and a lot of other women's stories are absent from early American academic research. And so she challenges people to continue in this way. It's definitely done through a feminist lens in Myles's work. And another person who takes on this sort of rereading of female writers in the past to kind of layer in a female narrative to the established historical canon is Johann Vincer. He wrote about the same letters and the same Esther story and drawing the same parallels between the two women. But he also goes a step further to say Edward Burrough, who originally transcribed those letters, also took out some of the more feisty tones, so really toned down her voice from those letters in the first place. So not only was Mary quieted in 1660 and in those prior years of dissent, she was also quieted later on in the scholarship. And so that was really drawn attention to in this 2016 article. In Myles's Monster article, she also charges future scholars to take another look at the Quaker literature, reread it, include other Quaker martyrs, include the other women, consider religion and writing and gender. And somebody who answered that almost directly is Heather Berry. In this article, Naked Quakers Were Not So Naked, in 2015, she answers that charge. She examines a group of 45 Quaker women who were in the Massachusetts Bay Colony and documents their experiences, draws parallels, makes connections, and it's a much broader story of persecution and martyrdom than just Mary Dyer's, and it's important that this gets layered in on top of the rest of early American history. The last person I'm going to highlight today that also continues this thread is Frances J. Bremer in Dissenting Puritans. It tells the story in a really nice narrative, detailed fashion of these two women and focuses on them as dissenters. Their dissent led to some of what we still value today as our rights. In response to Mary Dyer's execution, the king banned executions in Massachusetts. And that sort of beginning of free speech and the beginning of religious freedom echoes from these stories. And it's important that we don't exclude them from history. So they do have a lasting legacy. The two women are honored in statue form outside of the Massachusetts State House in Boston. And a lot of people attribute the story of Mary Dyer to kind of the kindling beneath the First Amendment. And I can't say it's not. And so this is a big thank you to the dissenters here. And I think there's a lot more work to be done on the feminist reframing of some of that narrative of early America.